In last week's study, we began the story of Joseph, and I told you that this would pretty much be the story till the end of Genesis. And I said pretty much or something like that because of today's chapter. In chapter 38 of Genesis, we take a break from the story of Joseph, just a one chapter aside, and then we get back to it. And today's title, as you can see on the screen, is Judah, Tamar, and a quote, prostitute, unquote, at the gate. And there's a reason why the word prostitute is in quotes. And if you don't know the story, you'll see why soon. If you do know the story, you already understand why that word is in quotes. Um, this is one of the stories today. We've had a couple of them already that you don't tell in Sunday school to kids. And that, in fact, we don't often talk about even in church to grown-ups. And as we go through the story today, you're going to see why. It's a tough story. It's a challenging story. It's a difficult story. It's one of those that partway through you're going to be scratching your head and going, why is this story even in the Bible? But hang in there because the payoff at the end of this chapter is well worth the story. There's a reason the story is in the Bible. The reason comes out very clearly at the end. Well, not very clearly if you're just doing a quick read through, but I will show you how at the very end of this chapter, we see the beautiful and wonderful reason why this difficult chapter is included in Scripture. But let's get right into it and get through this really challenging chapter. Genesis 38, beginning with verse 1. At that time, and by that time, it means as the time of Joseph's story, which will be unfolding in the next few chapters. So, what you've got is parallel lines here. You've got the line of Joseph's story happening here, and at the same time, in a different place, you've got the line of this story happening at exactly the same time. So, at that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. There, Judah met the daughter of a Canaanite man named Shua. He married her and made love to her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son who was named She conceived again and gave birth to a son and named him Onan. She gave birth to still another son and named him Shelah. It was at Kezib that she gave birth to him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. A bunch of things happening here that are not easy to recognize without some background. So let me give you some background. First of all, let's pause and recognize the timestamps here. We've just read 6 verses, and in that 6 verses, a good 15 to 20 years has passed. At the beginning of it, Judah is single. He leaves home. He finds a wife. He marries her. They have 3 kids, and the oldest one is, and they grow up enough that the oldest one is old enough to be married. Okay, so this is a good 15 to 20 years that happens. So that's the first thing that we've got here. Secondly, there's a lot of names and even places in the 6 verses that we just mentioned, including the fact that he married the daughter of a Canaanite person, right? This is the land. Remember, the original readers of Genesis are the people who have just been released from slavery, who are about to retake the promised land from the Canaanites. And so this is a story being told about the land they're going into and about some of the people that they're about to go in and overtake. So all of the names matter, especially to the people who first read it, and even to archaeologists and historians today, because these names and places can be time stamped, and we can go in and we can, dig archaeologically, and we can discover the historical truth of this. So this one time stamps it and tells us this happens over a long period of time, and 2, it tells us that it's happened in real time and space. It's not a made up story. It's not a fable. It's not a parable. Jesus told parables where he said things like a certain man went, and when Jesus doesn't give a name, what he's saying is, I'm making up the story to tell a point. Okay. But this is not a story made up to tell a point. This is a story that actually took place in time and space. And we know that because of the names and places that are mentioned here. So a lot going on here. But what we've got here, and I'll put up here on the screen what I already talked to you about. The story in this chapter happens in Israel, while the rest of Joseph's story unfolds in Egypt, as we'll see in the next chapters 39 through 41. So as Joseph is in Potiphar's house, as Joseph gets thrown in jail, as Joseph becomes in charge of Egypt, which we haven't seen yet, which we're about to see in the next few chapters, while that is taking place in Egypt, all of this chapter we're about to look at is taking place in the land of Israel. So while Joseph is honoring God in Egypt while sold into slavery, in the promised land, here's what's happening. Let's go to the next verse, Genesis 38:7. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother in law to raise up offspring for your brother. Now, let's put a pause there because from our culture, reading that just sounds like all kinds of creepy. And I can't get past the creepiness factor. And believe me, there's more creepiness to come in this chapter. Oh, but in this era, this is how a family line was kept intact. The way it was decided what land you owned and what property you would have, and the way order was kept with it was when they're within their society was ordered by families and clans and tribes. And so if you had someone who got married and then who died before having kids, that man's family line would end, which would cause disruption within his entire family because who gets his stuff? How does it get divided up? This land that was given to him, are we now going to have a dispute among all of his brothers about whose land this belongs to? And so, in order to keep civility, what they said was if a man dies before having a child, then that man's next of kin, his younger brother, would then come to his former wife, have children by the dead man's wife, but the children of the dead man's wife would legally be belong to the dead man and not to the man who actually bore them. So that the land that they had, the property that his brother had, so this was a way of a younger brother honoring the death of his older brother by keeping his older brother's line intact. I know that's confusing. I may have even lost you partway through that. I think I may have lost myself partway through that. But that's how they did it. In their culture, the next brother was responsible to keep his older brother's line intact if the older brother died. Now, without a kid, Er's line would end. And so this would happen. He'd come along, marry his brother's wife, but the kids would legally be his brother's and not his. Because of that, the next brother decides he's got a problem with this. And we read that in chapter 38, verse 9. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So Onan has an obligation to bring his father's widow, his brother's widow, into him as his wife, to have children by his brother's widow, so that his brother's widow will have kids and so that his brother's line will be kept alive, but he will not get any of the benefits financially or legally from those kids. They will belong to somebody else. He won't get any of their land. He won't get any of their property. He won't get any of their inheritance in any way. And so it was something that you simply were supposed to do sacrificially to keep your brother's line alive. But just like his brother was a wicked man, so wicked that God killed him, Onan's not a good guy either. So here's what happens. And again, the creepiness factor, get ready for it. It's about to get really bad and then worse. 38:9. But Onan knew that the child would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he spilled his semen on the ground to keep from providing offspring for his brother. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. I know it's not just creepy, it's like gross. Sorry. I'm telling you, if the Bible wasn't the Bible, Christians would not be giving them as gifts to their children. They'd be putting it behind lock and key, and you wouldn't be able to buy one until you were 21. There's just so many strange things. As another weird and interesting aside, this idea of the brother's wife spilling his semen onto the ground so that he would not impregnate his brother's wife. This is one of a couple passages in where some Christians who are against birth control because they've interpreted this as that you should never ever withdraw during the act of sex. You should just leave that to God. The problem here wasn't that he withdrew in order not to have children. The problem is that he didn't want to fulfill his responsibility to his brother and to his brother's widow. That's the problem here. This is not about birth control. This is about honoring his older brother and his older brother's widow. That's the problem here. And again, creepy. Let's move along. 38:11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow. I'm sorry. He wouldn't provide. Yeah. So what he did was wicked. So the Lord put him to death. We did have that. Okay. 38:11. So now Judah's got two dead sons, both married to this one woman, right? Genesis 38:11. Judah then said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, who has now lost two men, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he may die too, just like his brothers. He's concerned for the life of his third son, who's not old enough to have children by his now two brothers, one brother's wife and the other one who's supposed to be I don't even know what to call her to the second brother. All right. So Tamar went to live in her father's household. So Judah is two sons down. And what we've got here is Judah does not plan to honor his obligation to Tamar or to his son's family line. He's looking at it and going, I've already lost two sons. The young one's not even old enough to step in yet. I'm not going to let him step in. I'm going to tell her, go home. And when he's old enough, I'll get back to you. And he doesn't plan to do that. So both sons, one son was evil. Second son did not honor his older brother. And now Judah himself is not behaving in an honorable way, but is lying to his daughter-in-law about what he intends to do for her. Okay. So he sends her back to go home as a widow to live in her childhood home, which means she's basically abandoned because nobody else now will marry her. She has no prospects for her future. If it wasn't for her father taking her in, she would starve on the streets. She's put in a really, really bad situation in their culture because of this. No one else will marry her. She's considered, quote, damaged goods in their society, not to God, but to their society. And even if someone fell in love with her and wanted to marry her, probably wouldn't, because the legal thing would be so complicated if she did marry somebody outside the family now. It's just all kinds of complication that we today just don't have to deal with and don't understand. Okay. We have different complications, just not this one. All right. So it continues on now to chapter 38, verse 12. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. This is, typical for lifespans of that day. So now Judah has lost two sons and his wife. Okay. End of verse 12 of chapter 38. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah, that's a town, to the men who were shearing his sheep. And his friend Hira the Adullamite went with him. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, and then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that, though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. Again, this is a long passage of time. Shelah, in the last we looked at it, was too young to marry Tamar and take on the responsibility for his older brother by bearing children. He has now grown up and he's old enough. It has now been enough years passed by that Judah's wife has died. And now, as a single man, he is heading off to do business. At this point, Tamar recognizes he's not going to fulfill his obligation. I know that his son is old enough to have children with me, but he hasn't done that. I'm left alone. He has abandoned me. So she dresses up out of her widow's robes, which she was required to wear for the rest of her life, unless she bore children by her ex-husband's brothers. And she dresses up and she sits at the entrance of a city that she knows Judah will pass by because she knows where he's going. So why does she sit at the entrance of the city not wearing her widow's robes? Here's why. Chapter 38, verse 15. And the creepiness factor, I'm telling you, keeps getting even creepier now. 35:15. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute. And now you know why prostitute is in quotes in the title here. Because he thought she's a prostitute, but she's not. For she had covered her face. That's how they dressed then for prostitution. That was how they signaled that they were a prostitute. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, again because of the covered face, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. Oh, okay. Creepy. Okay. Continuing on in verse 16. And what will you give me to sleep with you? She asked. This is daughter-in-law to father-in-law. Ugh. Verse 17. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? She asked. He said, what pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. So she dresses up as a prostitute. He sees someone he thinks is a prostitute. He thinks, I'm going to have sex with that prostitute. They bargain the price of it. And he says, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. I don't have him with me now. And she says, well, how do I know you're going to send the young goat? You got to give me something of value that I can hold until you send me the goat. What do you want? I want your seal with the cord and I want a staff. Now, what does that mean? If you've ever seen an old document with a wax imprint on the envelope, you know what this is about. The seal, imagine you've got an old envelope and it doesn't have the rubber, the glue on the inside of the envelope like we have today. You have to seal it with wax. So they close the envelope. they'd drip wax on it from a candle, and then they would take a seal. Sometimes it was on the end of a ring, sometimes it would hang around their neck. This one was hung around the neck because it had a cord. So around his neck, he had a cord, and on it was a seal, like a metal seal, and that would be imprinted into the wax. So it was their version of a credit card. If he's out and he wants to buy something and he doesn't have the sheep or the goats or whatever they bargained for at the time, he says, okay, let me put my imprint into the wax. And that way you'll know that I'll come back. Okay. So she just says, I want to hold your credit card. That's what she's saying. And I want your staff. Why? Because in the family, multiple members of the family would have a seal with a cord. So all they knew was that it was the family seal. It could have been Judah. It could have been one of his other sons, or his wife. Not his wife because she's passed away, but or any other member of the household that he had entrusted another seal and cord to. So she wants to be sure that she can identify that it was not just any member of his household, but that it was him that she was about to have this relationship with. So she says, I want your staff, because the staff would be a very personal thing. It would have like his own insignia on it. It would have been very decorative. So the seal and cord is getting the credit card. The staff is getting his driver's license, his identity. Okay. So Judah's seal and cord were like today's credit card. Judah's staff would identify him as the holder of the seal and cord. Then they have sex, and like Jacob with Leah a generation before, he still doesn't recognize who he is. I don't know how these guys keep having sex with women and they don't know who they are. Some of it is the ceremonial way they did things back then, the veil that didn't come off. Who knows what's going on? The whole thing is weird and creepy and strange, and I don't want to dig into it too deeply. But they do. She gets pregnant. Now we move along with the rest of the story, chapter 38, verse 19. After she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. So she's acting like nothing had happened. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get his pledge back from the woman, but he did not find her. So Judah goes back home, says, I got to pay that prostitute, because without it, I don't have a credit card or a driver's license, right? Yeah, I don't have the seal or the staff. So he sends the goat like he says he will. His friend goes to pay her off with the goat. The friend looks around and can't find this, prostitute at the gate. Verse 21, he asked the men who lived here, where is the shrine prostitute who was beside the road at Enaim? There hasn't been any shrine prostitute there, they said. Like, we're around her. I don't know who you saw or who you're thinking of, but we don't know who that is. Verse 22. So we went back to Judah and he said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. So it's like, not only did I not find her, but they're telling me she doesn't exist. So verse 23, then Judah said, let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock. After all, I did send her the young goat, but you didn't find her. So he's like, okay, let's just let that go. Because if I pursue this any further, I'm going to look like an idiot. I'm going to have to tell everybody what I did, and I feel stupid, and that I handed this over to someone I thought was a prostitute that apparently doesn't even exist. Okay, she's gone. Everybody says she doesn't exist. Maybe I was imagining it and lost it. I don't know. And he just let the matter go, because the only thing that can happen by pursuing this is that it turns out really badly for me. So it continues on. Chapter 38, verse 24. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. There is nothing like the self-righteous indignation of a hypocrite, is there? I mean, seriously, our lack of self-awareness of our own sinfulness at times is just mind-boggling. It's incredible. And what I've noticed, and I think this is a principle we see in Scripture a lot too, is this. The more judgmental a person is about other people's sins, the more likely they're hiding their own sin. I found that to be universally true. And it's not that we don't stand in judgment of sin. It's not that we don't call people on their sin when it's appropriate. But have you ever met the people who are just going around? It seems like they're just always angry at sin. It's like over the top. In almost every case, that is a reaction to their covering up of their own sin. When somebody, on the other hand, has acknowledged their sin and found forgiveness, they act very differently. When we acknowledge our own sinfulness, we tend to have a lot more grace for others. So that's not universal. You can't say every time somebody accuses somebody of sin, they must be sinning themselves. But it's enough to send up warning flags. Anytime I see somebody, a preacher even out there, and they're just always condemning sin, it's like, dude, be careful. Literally every time I've ever known somebody who's had that kind of a, righteous indignation on the warpath against sin thing going on as their primary ministry identity, every time I'm aware of it, at some point or another, their own secret sins have come to roost, and they're huge. We saw the televangelist scandals of the 70s and 80s, right? That's what was behind those. They're on TV denouncing everybody else's sins, and they've got their own. And we have it over and over again. It's not just preachers, it's not just Christians, it's everybody. But when we've received God's grace, we tend then to be a little more gentle with other people's sins, because we recognize there before the grace of God go I. And once we've received grace, we tend to give grace to others, as the scripture says we ought to. So, especially in this case, he's got this really, really, arrogant idea of what's going on. We got to put her to death, even though he committed the same sin. And in fact, this exact same sin, which he doesn't realize yet. But let's take a look at how this comes revealed. Genesis 28:35. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. This is mic drop of mic drops. Like, oh, really? You want to put me to death for this? Okay. The person who fathered this child is the one who owns the steel, the staff, and this cord. You recognize them, Judah? And of course, she's established an airtight case. He can't argue that it's not his. He lost his. He probably had to get other ones made. When she shows it to him, nobody else would have made exactly that seal and exactly that staff in exactly that way. It wouldn't have happened. He is caught completely red-handed. And by waiting until her pregnancy has been discovered so that she's taken out into court. So she does this in front of witnesses. She does this really close to being killed herself for her own sin. And once everybody's gathered, this is actually almost a cinematic thing. This episode of this story is cinematic. Can you imagine this playing out in a movie, where somebody goes in and knocks on her door and you got to come, you're being accused of it. And last minute she's got, I got to rush and get my seal, the seal and the staff. And they're saying no. Or maybe the police come and grab her and pull her out, and she doesn't have time to grab the seal and the staff, right? I mean, you could play that up really big time in a movie. And at the very last second, somebody brings it to her. And at the very last second, just before she's sentenced to death, she displays this in court. We don't know exactly the timing, but wow, this is really one of those suspenseful moments. And then when it happens, you just have to look at it and go, that's just what an amazing thing. He cannot argue with it. So what's his response? Genesis 28:26, the only response he can make. Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her my son Shelah. And he did not sleep with her again. He finally sees the error of his ways. Not only does he admit his own mistake, but he recognizes. He doesn't say she's innocent. She says she's more righteous than me. She's not as guilty as me. What she did wasn't great either. But he goes, oh, I get why you did that now, because I put you in an impossible situation. I should have given you my son. That's what I was at an obligation to do. And I didn't. You notice, however, weirdly, he doesn't admit that, yes, he also should not have, slept with her, right? That's he shouldn't have had sex with her either. He doesn't admit that, but at least he acknowledges his own wrong. And then there's that weird sentence at the end of the verse, and he did not sleep with her again, which is like, of course he didn't have sex with her again after this. He knows it's his daughter. It's just, oh. Anyway, it's again just a really strange chapter, isn't it? So this now confirms Tamar's place in Judah's family. Her son is now acknowledged as Judah's son, which now brings her back into the family, so that she now has the full inheritance of the family, and her son and her sons who follow that will now have the full inheritance of the family. This matters in more ways than just for their time and just for their place, as we'll see now. Chapter 38, verse 27. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. So these are the boys that are biologically Judah's, okay, but now legally her ex-husband Er's, all right? There were twin boys. Verse 28, as she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the birth is coming, and the first thing that comes out is not a head, but a hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. We'll talk about why that matters in a moment. Verse 29. But when he drew it back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. So as much as this family fights, now you've got two brothers fighting in the womb. So again, why the scarlet thread? They tied the thread around the baby's wrist because the first twin to break the womb is the firstborn. Okay. So this is a legal thing that matters here. This gives him the leadership of the family. What we talked about before is the double portion. He would now be the leader of the family. But here's what's really interesting. Perez, the one who came out fully first, but was not considered legally the firstborn. Perez, who is technically not the firstborn, but the actual firstborn completely out of the womb, right? So you got this weird legal thing going on, is the reason for the story to be told. So here's why this story is told, because of Perez. Perez, we will see 16 mentioned 16 more times in scripture. Not because he does anything. Nothing else that he does is recognized. His birth is the only thing recognized. But he is mentioned in genealogies in 16 other places. And here are some of the key ones. In the book of Ruth, it says, "This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon. Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz. Boaz the father of Obed. Obed the father of Jesse. And Jesse the father of David." Perez is in the family line for King David. Now, why does this matter? Because the genealogy through David matters, because then through the genealogy of David, we eventually get to who? To Jesus. And it starts with Judah, right? Judah has a sexual relationship, an inappropriate sexual relationship with his daughter-in-law Tamar, because he dishonored her now, one, by not giving her the proper opportunity to have a baby through his son, and then by going to what he thinks is a prostitute. But nevertheless, two sons are born. One of them, Perez, becomes the family line of Jesus. And here's why this matters. Jesus is, while the rest of the story is going to concern Joseph in Genesis, Jesus is not called the Lion of the tribe of Joseph. He's called the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? Jesus had to be born from Judah's tribe. That's why the family line matters so much. And yes, Perez, the Perez of this story, of Judah and Tamar, of this horrible, ridiculous, ugly feeling story, is one of the links in the genealogy that eventually brings us Messiah Jesus. It's just the strangest thing. So yes, for the rest of Genesis, we'll concentrate on Joseph and his story, because Joseph's being sent to Egypt will preserve the entire family and keep them alive. But this story matters because this is where the genealogy that leads to David and that eventually leads to Jesus comes. It does not come through Joseph. It comes through this strange story with Judah, eventually to David, and eventually to Jesus. So Perez, through his great, how many of, I don't know if I got all the right greats in there or not, through great grandson David, he is a necessary link in the messianic line. So Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. He's also in the Gospels called the Son of David. And that is assured, that happens by the thinnest of margins right here, because of this strange, awkward, and ugly story of Judah and Tamar. We see it later on also in Matthew chapter 1, verse 3, in the genealogy of Jesus. Matthew 1:3 says, Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez, the father of Hezron, and then it goes all the way to Jesus. In Luke, in Jesus' genealogy, we also see the son of Amminadab, the son of Ram, the son of Hezron, son of Perez, the son of Judah. So Perez is mentioned in both of the genealogies of Jesus, mentioned in Matthew and Luke, and Tamar gets a mention in Matthew. In fact, Tamar is one of only 5 women mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus. Through this bizarre, strange, ugly episode, we still see the Messiah come through that. So the lesson of all of that is what? It's this. This shows again that God can use anyone to fulfill his purpose. Remember, and this clearly underlines a principle that we will continue to come back to and have seen so many times before. Once again, God is the hero of the story. You cannot look at the story and see Judah as a hero. No. You can't look at the story and see Tamar as the hero. No, they both did wrong things. You can't look at the story and see Perez as the hero. He's just a kid who was born. The only way to look at this is to see that God's redemptive plan, even through their ugliness. See, God did not ordain those actions. God did not want to be an evil man so that he had to kill him. God did not want Onan to spill his seed so that Tamar would not get pregnant. God did not want Judah to withhold his third son, Shelah, from Tamar so that she had to deceive Judah. God did not want Judah and Tamar to have this near incestuous, sinful relationship. None of that was ordained by God, but all of it was used by God for his redemptive plan. So that's another kind of lesson in it too, is we can't confuse the fact that God uses bad situations to think that this bad situation in itself is okay. No, this is redemption. God is the hero who steps in even to the ugliness of this story and says, I can use even that to bring about my redemptive plan, which means no matter what we've done, no matter what sins we've committed, if we repent of them and when we move forward and we ask to be a part of God's plan, he can use even our lowest points as part of the plan that he wants to bring things, great things out of our lives and into the lives of other people. So anyway, there's the end of that ugly little chapter, but I hope you thought it was worthwhile to stick around for that hopeful little piece at the end. Yeah, I know it was for me. Next week, and for the rest of our Genesis series, we will be in the life of Joseph. Next week, we'll take a look at Joseph as a slave in Egypt in the house of Potiphar, how he behaves correctly, and how things, at least in the natural, seem to go bad for him after behaving correctly. Stick around for these ones. These next few chapters of Joseph are a lot of fun to go through. We'll see you next time.